Whenever we talk about personality in psychology, the topic almost always goes to personality traits. Personality traits can be viewed as being characteristic ways of behaving. We all have our comfort zones regarding our behavior. Some people like peace and quiet, while others enjoy being surrounded by people. Some people like to be very structured and organized, while others prefer taking things as they come and being more flexible. One isn't necessarily better than the other, and there is no one best personality trait. All of them have their strengths and their disadvantages. While our personalities are hugely personal and unique, psychology attempts to identify the larger components of our personality and to draw comparisons as a way of identifying the differences between people's personalities, as well as the causes of specific traits. This means that there's a long history in psychology of looking at what parts of our personality are able to be identified and measured. One of the first people to really focus on this topic was an American psychologist named Gordon Allport. During the early to mid 20th century, Allport dedicated his career to identifying the different types of traits that make up our personality, how they can be measured, and how they developed. The way he did this was by going through all the words in the English language that can be used to describe somebody. He came up with nearly 4,500 words in total. I'm always a little amazed by this because first, this sounds like a really boring job. Second, I can't believe we actually have thousands of words in English just to be used to describe other people. Allport noticed in compiling his list that some aspects of our personality could fall into different categories. He started to identify that there were different types of traits. In fact, there are three main categories or types of traits that he identified. These are cardinal traits, central traits, and finally secondary traits. A cardinal trait is a part of your personality that is extremely dominant and tends to influence all other traits. Do you know someone that is just really anxious and it seems like that anxiety and fear just tends to permeate everything they do? This would be an example of a cardinal trait for that person. Central traits form the bulk of our personality and are usually what we talk about when we mention personality traits. This can include things like extroversion and introversion, openness, and agreeableness. Central traits are typically what are measured in personality tests. Secondary traits can be thought of as being much less stable and consistent. They are viewed more as being interests, hobbies, or just parts of our personality that present themselves during specific times. For example, when I was a kid, I used to really hate public speaking. I'd be fine talking to friends and family. I had no issue with talking to my teachers or coaches. However, as soon as I had to stand up in front of class, I would get really scared. Of course, I think back on that now and kind of laugh because it's something that I do every single day as a teacher. It also goes to show how these types of secondary traits don't really stick around for too long either. I like to describe the difference between these three types of traits as consisting of four main components. Those components are consistency, stability, frequency, and dominance. Consistency means how likely a person is to engage in that behavior. Cardinal traits are more consistent and secondary traits are not. Like with me, only having problems with speaking in a specific setting, like if I had to stand up in class and talk. If this were a cardinal trait, I would have difficulty talking with anyone in any setting. Stability refers to how stable that trait is over the course of a person's life. Cardinal traits are very stable, difficult to change, and tend to stay with a person throughout their lives. Secondary traits are more easily changed and flexible. Frequency refers to how common a trait may be. Cardinal traits are very rare, and not everybody necessarily has them. If they do, there's usually just one main cardinal trait present. However, secondary traits tend to be very common, and everyone has a multitude of these types of traits. After all, another way of looking at secondary traits is that they're just interests, hobbies, preferences. Just think for a second about how many of those you have. The last component is dominance. This means how much that trait tends to dominate all other parts of a person's personality. Cardinal traits are very strong. I like to think of them as almost being like a bully. They tend to force all the other traits to just back down and go along with them. Secondary traits are the exact opposite. They're very weak and don't necessarily exert a strong influence on the other types of traits. Keeping this in mind, central traits are basically the middle ground between these extremes. When we talk about personality traits in psychology, we mostly focus on central traits because they tend to be more common, stable, and easier to compare from one person to the next. Now, obviously, coming up with thousands of ways to measure each one of the words that Allport discovered would be impossible and very time-consuming. Seeing this limitation, another psychologist named Raymond Cattell started to narrow down Allport's list to just identify the central traits. What he did was start to group words together that were similar. So basically, words that are synonyms for one another. For example, extrovert would be grouped with sociable and outgoing. After grouping similar words together, he narrowed down the possible personality traits from thousands to just 171 traits. However, even this seemed to be too long, so he narrowed it down further to 16 key central traits and incorporated it into what he called the 16 personality factors, or the PF model. Although this was the first attempt at developing a model that could describe the key central traits of personality, many people questioned whether Cattell's categories were too broad. Others, namely Hans and Sybil Eysenck, a husband and wife team of German psychologists, had differing views of what should qualify as central personality traits. Their views were much more influenced by what they believed to be biological influences of personality. They felt that two main areas of a person's personality, extroversion, introversion, and neuroticism, stability, were primarily genetic in nature. They thought this formed the basis of our personality traits and that all other traits basically developed from them. Neuroticism, by the way, is the tendency towards emotional instability. Typically, people that have high rates of neuroticism are also very nervous and anxious people. What some people would term worrywarts. While people viewed Cattell's model as being too broad, there was a view that this model was too narrow. Splitting the difference between these two views led psychology to develop what is known as the 5-factor model. The 5-factor model looks at identifying 5 general central personality traits. Those traits are conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. You can remember these by using the first letter of each trait to form the acronym of CANOE. If that doesn't work for you, you can also rearrange them to spell ocean. The actual order of these traits isn't really that important, so it doesn't really matter which word comes first and which last. Conscientiousness refers to how motivated and disciplined a person is. Agreeableness refers to how much someone is willing to work with and cooperate with other people. Neuroticism, I mentioned earlier, is the tendency towards unstable emotions and moods. People with higher neuroticism generally tend to have higher rates of anxiety overall. Openness refers to how open a person is to experience new things, exploring new interests, and being exposed to different perspectives and different cultures. Extroversion refers to aspects of personality that lead to a person being more sociable, assertive, and expressive with other people. While the 5-factor model is one of the oldest and most influential, there are other models proposed to explain which traits are key to describing a person's personality profile. These include things like the HEXACO Model, which looks at honesty, emotionality, extroversion, and here the X in extroversion is used, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. The big difference between the HEXACO model and the 5-factor is that honesty is added and neuroticism is changed to emotionality. Part of the reason for this is that the term neuroticism has a very bad connotation, and personality traits shouldn't be thought of as being good or bad. After all, there can be some benefits to being someone that worries a lot, and there's definitely some drawbacks to being somebody who doesn't worry enough. This also opens the door for the question of how much culture may influence personality traits. Some cultures tend to value one trait more than others. For example, in the United States, I think that extroversion is generally held up as being preferred to introversion. However, this seems to be different in other cultures, like in Eastern Asia, where the opposite may be true. Regardless of the model used to profile someone's personality, remember that these traits don't just exist as a yes/no. Something like extroversion isn't just present or not present. Some people may be strongly extroverted or just moderately extroverted. By identifying not just if a certain personality trait is present, but also how strong or weak it may influence us, can help provide a blueprint to describe the vast complexity that is our personality. Thanks for watching, everyone, and if you're enjoying content like this, please be sure to give me a like and to subscribe to my YouTube channel so I can continue to produce these videos. Have a great day.